Hi.
Hello.
Thanks for your patience there. I'm going to narrate because my slides are quite image focused. So this first one is marked by COVID's logo on a black background. My name and contact information, I'm Sarah Senk. I am an associate professor at Cal State Maritime Academy. And as Natalie mentioned, I am a strategic advisor to the co-founders of Marked by COVID. I wanted to clarify that I have not lost anyone close to me to COVID, but Kristen Ortiza, one of the co-founders, and I were roommates in college, and about a year and a half in, she approached me and said, you happen to be a scholar of memory studies, and we're working on this national memorial project, and would you consider coming and working with the community and talking about memorial precedents? And from there, it sort of blossomed. I think I got sucked in by this incredible work the organization was doing. So Marked by COVID is the COVID-19 Justice and Remembrance movement that is led by COVID grievers. When Kristen's dad, Mark, died from COVID in June 2020, Kristen and her partner, Christine Hughes, immediately, within a week, founded the organization. It's a nonprofit. And they built a membership of thousands of bereaved activists very quickly. One of the primary goals of the organization is to ensure that all of the lives lost to the pandemic, many behind closed doors or uncounted, unmarked, unreported, are formally recognized in a national COVID memorial. And the image here is a screen capture of a June 2021 tweet in which Kristen marks the anniversary of her dad's death. And the tweet includes this photo of a vivacious and alive Mark giving 2 thumbs up. I can't remember the event that he was at that one, but the text of the tweet reads, June 10th, 2020, my dad was healthy, my mom was healthy. On June 11th, he had COVID. The future, I imagine, faded as I was restrained to a front row seat of this uneven catastrophe, trapped by class. He died in 20 days. The Kristen I was died with him. And there's a hashtag marked by COVID, or mark the date. So. The next slide is a black slide with the white text that reads, what does current collective memory look like? So the COVID-19 pandemic has transformed life as we know it, but with well over now 1.2 million dead, recorded dead in the US alone, we rarely hear battle cries of never forget. And almost since day one, the dominant national discourse on both sides of the political aisle has focused on moving on. Without reckoning with the unevenness of the pandemic and the conditions that made marginalized communities so vulnerable in the first place. And so fundamentally, Marked by COVID's memorial work promotes healing and resilience by recognizing that collective and individual suffering. The underlying belief is that only societies that acknowledge their past failures can prevent future ones. Ortiza and Keefe center the voices of those most harmed in all of Marked by COVID's work to ensure that, first, the worst consequences of the US pandemic response are not left to the shadows. And secondly, that the national story represents the full range of lived experiences, not only those with the resources to share their stories. And I won't have time to get into this today, but what I'm referring to here is that this idea that there's a literal cost to traditional healing and mourning, including the price tags for traditional markers like burial plots, individual headstones, obituaries in local newspapers. And this is something, this next slide is just a quote of something that Kristen said to me back in late summer of 2022. She said, inequality continues at death, but I'm stopping it at the legacy. I cannot bring my dad back, but I can make sure history accurately tells the story of how and why he, and now at that point in time, 1 million people in the US have died. So the next slide is an image of 2 screenshots. I'll just mention that since 2020, Marked by COVID has sponsored what they call honest obituaries, designed to create a more equitable historical archive. So on this premise that people who couldn't afford to put obituaries in local papers and build that archive, that was the first kind of memorial action and first action that they did. And so these images here, the first is a screenshot of Marked by COVID's website featuring obituaries for Mary Castro, Jose Antonio Reyes Dupont, Juan Reinaldo Forte, Juan Carlos Rangel, Isabel Papadimitriou, and Mark Ortiza, all of which were published between July and September 2020. And then the other one is a screenshot of a CNN article that reads, people are using honest obituaries to blame governors for coronavirus deaths and invite them to their loved ones' funerals, which is like the most barely emotionally stripped version of what was going on, but not inaccurate. So in addition to forcing public health to the forefront of national conversations through media outreach that ended up having a massive, massive reach, through vigils and storytelling, they created countless, they coordinated countless bereaved activists to secure official recognition of a COVID Memorial Day in more than 250 cities in a dozen states. They'd already done this before I joined. I was blown away by this. You actually get people working, like having full-time jobs and responsibilities and doing this like in their quote-unquote spare time, while also really struggling to make ends meet. And being deeply in grief and disenfranchised grief at that time. So they also created the Marked by COVID Memorial Matrix, which is a crowdsourced online library of COVID memorials to demonstrate the tremendous grassroots support and the need for public remembrance. And so the image on the screen right now is screenshots of these various things, the COVID Memorial Day, virtual vigils, the Memorial Matrix website, and so on. Let's see. So one of the biggest challenges that pandemic memorial projects face is how to account for what Urquiza and Keeves call the unevenness of experience. So Marked by COVID blends personal mourning with political action to highlight the pandemic as a slow disaster whose impacts in the USA and elsewhere hit poor and working class people and people of color significantly harder. And this image on the screen right now is a screenshot of Kristen speaking at the 2020 DNC, where her speech highlighted the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on minoritized communities and echoed also what she had written in her father's obituary. I think one of her first news appearances was to just ask her to read the obituary. And the line that many people found so compelling and encouraged so many people with a similar experience to reach out to her online was, "Mark, like so many others, should not have died from COVID-19. This is from his obituary. His death is due to the carelessness of the politicians who continue to jeopardize the health of brown bodies through a clear lack of leadership, refusal to acknowledge the severity of the crisis, and inability and unwillingness to give clear and decisive direction on how to minimize risk." And so this was what the model of the obituary that they were encouraging and funding early on. So my next slide is just white text on a black background that reads, as a reminder at this point, there's over 1.2 million counted US COVID deaths, tens of millions of people disabled by long COVID. Medically vulnerable are still isolated. The US life expectancy for BIPOC people are down over 4 years at this point, the average life expectancy. And there are hundreds of thousands of children orphaned. The number is around it's over 300,000. I know in California, the estimate's about 25,000. Okay. So recognition, skip that too soon. Recognition of lives lost, but in particular of lives lost due to structural inequities, was a crucial piece of Marked by COVID's early policy platform, which was developed at the time by a massive and diverse community of activists, and also with some in partnership with Kristen's policy grad school classmates from UC Berkeley. But the key part is that the community was really the centerpiece of the organization's work. So I'm seeing a lot of parallels between what Cody was talking about too. Public memorials democratize grief and healing by creating shared mourning spaces that are accessible to people in an ideal scenario. And Marked by COVID has from the beginning insisted that to ensure that these memorials truly represent a range of experiences, they must be rooted in those communities. The grassroots foundation of this organization is what ensures that the memorial represents experiences that might otherwise be silenced for a potentially rosier picture of history. This image is a picture of 500 empty chairs with votive candles on the seats at Marked by COVID's Dia de los Muertos observance in November 2020, outside, I believe this is in Phoenix. Right. So outside of the State House. And so this is partly a political action, but also a memorial action. And a heading reads, "We are working to identify and memorialize every life lost to COVID." So at the same time that it has this grassroots foundation, one of the things we've talked about a lot is that it's so important for memorials to gain broad recognition and legitimacy. So if you think about national memorials like the AIDS Memorial Quilt, signal to people that those losses matter and deserve to be remembered. They give space for public mourning and provide a springboard for the kinds of national level solutions that only become possible with the recognition of a disaster. And I'll say as a side note here that as we continue to navigate, Christine, by the way, has a background too in working with the Purple House in San Francisco and doing a lot of work with HIV/AIDS. And so she she's always talking about how AIDS has claimed the lives of, well, at this point, well over 700,000 people in the US, but over a period of 40 years, while COVID has already taken more than 1.2 million lives in less than 5 years. And so each crisis presents its own challenges, but the scope of loss in both sort of shapes how we approach commemoration. So with this widespread and uneven impact on various communities, the COVID-19 pandemic presents this challenge for memorialization. There are no physical ruins or mass graves to serve as lasting reminders of the loss and trauma experienced, although some of those photos from the mass graves in New York do sort of linger in the collective consciousness in some instances. And my next slide is a quote that I told many people about this book at this conference. Elizabeth Outcome published this book, uncannily timed in the end of 2019, called Viral Modernism, about the 1918 flu. And she talks about this in her coda, that the quote is, "A lethal pandemic leaves few tangible reminders behind. No buildings collapse, no battlefields or crash sites are preserved, rarely do memorials mark its passing. Its effects are felt everywhere, but located in no particular place, except perhaps in the bodies and memories of the living who remain." And I think here, before I talk about the memorial itself, that one of the things that Kristen has said many times, if you listen to interviews, and I recommend there's a podcast, 99% Invisible, did a feature on the memorial that has really extensive interviews with Kristen, and also features me swearing. My biggest audience of all time that I'll ever have as an academic. But she said this over and over, that how might our initial national response to COVID have been different if the 1918 flu was more than one sentence in my history textbook? Like, would people, there's not really like a bunch of 1918 flu memorials. There's one I know of in Vermont, a very small localized one. But so there's also the issue of those deaths being unmarked, that the estimate range, it's so wide, it's like 50 to 100 million, and that's partly because so many of those deaths were coded as war deaths. They were not coded as pandemic deaths. And so imagine, right, if that pandemic had loomed larger in the cultural imaginary, would people have dismissed COVID as just a flu if they knew what a flu was capable of doing? So this brings me to, and this image is just a description of marked by COVID, it's a logo, marked by COVID's logo for the National COVID Memorial. So, and for me, this PowerPoint does not show the videos, but afterwards we have this, you can test it out for yourself with the AR lens. So, marked by COVID's National COVID Memorial, it's a hybrid analog and digital monument that individually honors the catastrophe and still growing number of pandemic victims with no ground zero. So the image here, it's an image of the augmented reality component, which is a spiral made up of black and white photos of individual faces on a yellow and orange background. And in this image, the spiral surrounds the white obelisk of the Washington Monument. And it was part of an act about making this visible and making this prominent on the mall. Like, what would that look like? What could that look like? And reappropriating this kind of monumental, I got 2 minutes, okay, let me go real fast. And there's also a little video here of the memorial features, so they are clickable. And so you have this spiral of faces that comes up, and you can click on them individually and also search for them. And you'll notice that each of them has the person's name, the birth date and death date, the photo, and then a quote in the words of the people who were closest to them. And what was so important about this too is, again, I think resonating with what Cody was talking about, it was so important for community members to have this in their own words and to say that we don't want people speaking for us here, and we also don't want people making this like a sort of story about necessarily heroism or like overcoming. Like, some people want to express rage against what happened to their loved ones and the fact that these deaths were preventable, and so many of these are political messages. There are then also some, like this next one, that do fall into that. You know, she was a hero, and the sort of consolatory discourse. The other important piece of this is that, so the physical and digital components are customizable. And so the image on the left is of a griever leaving an offering at the debut we did for Dia de los Muertos in LA. Sorry, there's a typo, there should be October 2022. And so what is so, I think, crucial about this, and I'll mention, talk real fast right here, is that all of this came about through hundreds of coordinated community meetings. So it was a really inclusive design process where thousands of bereaved community members gave their input, and we had weekly online meetings through 2021 and 22, and community members collectively decided how that memorial, how it should look and feel and function. And they agreed that they had to have a name, they had to have some element of sharing their stories in their own words. And the reason that we were talking about digital components is because the scale of the loss, Kristen did a little math and was like, you'd have to wrap the National Mall with 52 times in like Vietnam Veterans Memorial style stone in order to account for all of the names alone at that point. And so I think I will mention that what helped bring this to life was Snapchat. So we approached them when we were looking as a nonprofit without a lot of money at the time, looking for a partner to create something that would render this tangible, or tangible enough so that we could show, like, have a proof of concept. And so they agreed to make this, and you can demo it here with the code. So if people do not already have Snapchat on their phones, I have my phone available for people to test this. So we'll wrap up real quickly that ultimately, I'm skipping to my conclusion, that the memorial, the hope is that it lays strategic groundwork for social change. So by foregrounding the personal testimonies and remembrances, the idea is that the memorial archives the systemic failures and uneven toll of the pandemic through the stories of people's loved ones are sharing, and that it avoids a single monolithic narrative and also actively counters the narrative that I think is dominating a lot of cultural production that downplays the severity of the pandemic. And moreover, by centering on the remembrances of the loved ones, it foregrounds this decentralized, community-driven nature of memorialization in this case, that each testimonial contribution and photo adds to this collective historical record and ensures that those personal dimensions remain central to our collective understanding. And also by showcasing the lived experience of those who lost loved ones, by really putting that front and center, it challenges the tendency to trivialize or minimize the pandemic's impact and insists instead on this honest reckoning. So I will stop there for the sake of time and happy to answer questions later.